Hello, my name is David Haight. I'm here to invite each and every one of you to join a movement of New Yorkers that are saving the land that feeds us. New Yorkers have a proud history of taking action to protect special places that were at risk of being destroyed. Perhaps one of the greatest examples can be seen just to our north in the Adirondacks. Back in the 1800s, stories were emerging that vast areas of forests were being destroyed by poor forestry practices, by forest fires and other human activity. And as a result, New Yorkers took action. We amended our state constitution. We enacted state policies. We've invested millions of dollars. And as a result, we have the 6 million acre Adirondack Park, the largest protected area in the continental United States. This is a place that I know well because I grew up in a family that bought a home just a mile outside the boundary of the Adirondack Park. I was a child of parents that moved there and planned to only stay for 1 year. And 45 years later, they're still there. And they're there because they fell in love with the mountains, the lakes, the rivers. And I grew up hiking and camping and fishing and canoeing and got to experience what it's like to be in the outdoors and what that can do for you physically and mentally and spiritually. And it's a place I like to go back to with my wife and my kids as often as we can. But as a child, I also got to see how people connected with the land in a different way, right out my own front door, because right across the street was an apple orchard. And I got to see a family, multiple generations of a family, that were making a living by growing food. And I got to grow up as part of a community where many families were involved in farming, and many businesses in town drew some of their income from farmers. Now, this connection with people growing food took a new chapter when 15 years ago I moved to Saratoga Springs, just to our north. And as a young person in town, I decided I would go down to the local farmer's market one day. And I saw a beautiful woman who was a flower farmer there. And I said, "Whoa, who's that?" She was a flower farmer selling flowers. I became a flower buyer who bought a lot of flowers. And 15 years later, my wife Suzanne and I have had the opportunity to enjoy what it means to farm and to sell local farm products to local people. I've also got to see the challenge of a poorly timed rainstorm or a failed marketing effort and how that can hit you very closely in your bank account. Now, for most Americans, growing food, the enterprise of farming, is not something they have personal experience with. Less than 2% of all Americans are involved in producing the food that we need to survive. Yet more and more Americans, more and more New Yorkers, are thinking about their food. They're thinking about their food because for some, they recognize that so much of our personal health, the health of our children, the health of our families, many of the public health problems we face as a society are related to the food we eat. For others, they recognize that the dollars that we spend on food have power. And if we direct those dollars in our own community, that can have incredible impact on our economy. And lastly, for others, they recognize that choices that farmers make when they grow our food have important impacts on the environment. And as a result, we've seen an explosion of places like farmers markets. You see new choices when you go to the grocery store now, when you go to a restaurant. Those individual choices we're making are having a difference. But we're also thinking more about our food as a society. According to the United Nations, we need to grow 70% more food by the year 2050 in order to feed the 9 billion mouths that will be on this planet and the people that are undernourished today. In the next 35 years, we need to nearly double the amount of food that we produce. And that is going to become harder because of a changing climate. You know, this week, we have our leaders from around the world are in Paris talking about climate change and what we're going to do to mitigate this incredible problem facing us. Perhaps no area of our society is as affected as our farmers and our food producers. You've seen things like this past year in California, the drought in California has taken 1 million acres of farmland out of food production. We saw events like Hurricane Irene, Tropical Storm Lee that flooded farm fields here in New York. We have new plant diseases, new insects that are destroying crops in the field. The challenges facing food production are greater than they have ever been before. The margin of error is getting less. But in all of that complexity and all of that change, there are some really basic ingredients that you need to grow food. It's things like plants, animals, people, water, sunlight, and soil. Soil. I want to focus on that last ingredient because it's so precious and it's so limited. If you were to take a view of the entire Earth and look at the entire Earth's surface, if you were to strip away the parts of this planet that are covered by oceans and lakes and rivers and ice and deserts and land that just wasn't suitable for farming, if you were to strip all of that away from this planet, you would be left with a tiny little sliver, less than 3% of our planet is available for growing food. Less than 3%. Now, Will Rogers is famously paraphrased and perhaps misquoted as saying, invest in land because they're not making any more of it. And what we're seeing is that other countries that don't have much farmland are just doing just that. Countries like China, Qatar, Saudi Arabia are going out and buying or leasing millions of acres of farmland in places like Africa, South America. You're seeing private investors, private companies that are doing the same. This controversial practice of land grabbing in part reflects that those countries, they recognize that being able to feed your people, that food security, is fundamental to national security. And for those private investors, they recognize this is an asset that is limited. And if we need it to grow more food, there's financial opportunity here. Now, if you were to look around the world where there's the greatest supplies of fertile ground, if you were to rank every nation on this planet by their soil wealth, the amount of land that they have for growing food and for farming, guess where you'd stop? Right here in the United States. The United States ranks second in the world in our soil wealth, the amount of fertile ground, the amount of land that we have for producing food in this country. Half the land in America today is involved in farming. And yet, tragically, here in this nation, the place with so much, the place of plenty, we have been destroying this precious resource by paving it over, turning fertile fields into subdivisions and strip malls, making concrete the last crop that can be grown on that land. And perhaps one of the greatest places where we've seen this trend is right here in New York. Now, if you were to talk to somebody from outside of New York and you were to ask them, tell me what you think of when you think of New York, they wouldn't think of a farm. But New York is incredibly well poised to grow a lot of food. We have entrepreneurial farmers. We have more than 7 million acres of farmland. We have a lot of fresh water. We have all of these resources in close proximity to 19 million eaters. There is such an opportunity here in New York. And as a result, New York is one of the leading food producers in America. We're in the top 5 in the country in producing nearly 15 different fruits, vegetables, and dairy products. Think about things like apples, grapes, sweet corn, milk. If you want to put it in your mouth, if you want to eat it, there's a good chance that New York is a leading state in growing it. And yet, tragically, here in New York, we have paved over the equivalent of nearly 5,000 farms in the last 30 years. At the peak of it, it was 2 farms a week we were paving over in this state. The causes are many. Some of them include that some of these farms were located where populations were growing near New York City. In other places, it's where populations were spreading. We were actually losing population in much of upstate New York, but people were choosing to move out of cities and build new houses in the countryside. They were moving out of places like Buffalo, like Rochester, like Syracuse, like Albany. It's because communities saw farming as a temporary land use until something better came along. It's because farmers were struggling to make a good living from their land. And when they were at a point in their lives, like when they needed to retire, their 401k was their land itself. And when they put it up for sale, the person that was going to pay them the most was a real estate developer. And as a result, today, 80% of the fruit, 80% of the vegetables, and nearly half the milk that is produced in New York is produced in places that are under threat of real estate development. But there's good news. There's good news, because there is a movement in New York where people are taking action to protect this land that we need to feed us. It started back in the 1970s out on eastern Long Island. On Long Island, they had seen suburban development after World War II consume countless farms moving outside of New York City. In Suffolk County, the farthest eastern end of Long Island, farmers and community leaders there saw that if they didn't take action, there would be no farms left soon on Long Island. And so they came up with this novel concept of paying a farmer to keep their land permanently available for farming and growing food, ostensibly to buy the development rights on those farms. And since Suffolk County put this idea forward back in 1974, hundreds of local governments, 28 states, the federal government, and hundreds of private community-based land trusts have developed programs to permanently protect land for farming and growing the food we need. Here in New York, next year in 2016, we're going to celebrate the 20th anniversary of our state's Farmland Protection Program. This is a program where the state of New York has worked with community-based land trusts, worked with farm families, has now enabled the state to permanently protect more than 200 farms across New York State. And thanks to the leadership of Governor Cuomo and our state legislature, this year, 2015, we had more funding than ever before in our state budget for protecting working farmland. For the first time ever, New York was in the top 5 in the country in states that were investing in protecting working farms. And guess what? This young movement is starting to get some traction. When this movement started, at the worst of it, for every farm that was being protected in New York, we were losing 10. We were paving 10 farms over for every one we were going to keep. And that gap has started to shrink. And now today, you can see that we're protecting virtually as many farms as we're losing. And in the next 10 years, you could see a future where we'll actually protect more farms, more places for us to grow food than we're going to lose. But yet this movement is a young one, and there is a need for much more to be done. And there's an opportunity for every New Yorker to do something about it. And there's really 3 simple ways that New Yorkers can get involved. First, by spreading the word. Government leaders at all levels of government, in cities and towns and counties and state governments like in Albany and Washington, they need to hear about the importance of public investment in protecting our working farms, just like we have in protecting places like the Adirondack Park and other parks and other playgrounds and other special places that matter to New Yorkers. We need to invest that in the same way in protecting the places we need to grow food. And we're seeing results. Suffolk County, who I mentioned first, they have now invested over $1 billion in protecting farms and open space. Today, nearly half the farms in Suffolk County are permanently protected. In other communities, we're seeing people that are going to their town hall, to their city hall. They're going and they're speaking out about the need to save farms in their community planning processes. Communities every week, you could go to a community board that's planning for where we want housing, where we want commerce, where we want industry. In the past, people have seen farming as just something that was there until one of those other uses came along. Now, people are speaking out about the need to plan for where we're going to have our farmers. Where are we going to grow food in our community? That is just as important as all those other community needs. Today in New York, nearly 100 communities have developed their specific plans of how they're going to support local farmers and how they're going to protect the land they need for farming and growing food. Communities like the town of Clarence outside of Buffalo, communities like the town of Pittsford outside of Rochester, communities like Warwick and Red Hook in the Hudson Valley. These are communities that have taken concrete steps to ensure that people will be able to farm and grow food in that community forever. And lastly, the third thing that every New Yorker could do is to buy locally. And this is something I think for many of us we're thinking about for ourselves, for our families. But there are such opportunities to spread that further. You see this in the parents, the volunteers, the professionals perhaps that are working in a kitchen, in a school, or a college, or a hospital, or a senior center, or a daycare program. These institutions are purchasing a lot of food and feeding a lot of New Yorkers, including a lot of vulnerable populations of New Yorkers. If we can intentionally steer more of those dollars into our own backyard, if we can leverage that collective purchasing power, we're going to help our farmers make a better living from their land and feel less pressure to have to sell it. One of the great examples is right down the street here at the University of Albany. University of Albany last year spent $160,000 of their money that they're going to spend on feeding students on campus. They use that money to buy food from local farmers. And they have made a commitment to spending half of the money that they spend on food on buying it from local farms in the future. And they're a part of a state university system that has more than 200,000 mouths on campuses that spend $100 million a year on buying food. If we can harness that type of purchasing power and put more of those dollars into our own backyard, there is incredible power. There's incredible things that we can do. Now, this movement is a young one, but it's growing. It's going to leave a legacy that is going to ensure that people, that New Yorkers, are going to be able to farm and grow food in our communities forever. It's a movement that is with farmers, but it's not for farmers. It's for all of us eaters. And the reason why is simple. As Benita said, no farms, no food. Thank you.